So my name is Ashley. He's already covered that. I'm the principal UX consultant for SafeNet. We're a consulting firm in the area, but I mean they do some accessibility stuff, but that's not why I wanted to give this talk. In fact, the reason they do accessibility stuff is because I basically pressed a button. Here we go. I mean, I will press that button for that yet. But accessibility has been a passion of mine. I impressed upon them the importance of it, and now I'm trying to go out and talk to other people about it. I purposely kept this very technology agnostic. There's a lot of different frameworks you can use, a lot of different tools. We'll talk a little bit about that, but really I wanted to take a step back and talk about accessibility in general, not just accessibility for TypeScript or accessibility for React or accessibility for Angular. All of those do have some accessibility components built in. There are some frameworks for each of them, but I'll just give you a little bit at the end of that. This is going to be more on a general note. So I'll go through these very quickly. The reason that companies care about accessibility isn't necessarily because they always love and care for all their users, which they should, but they don't. It's because there's a lot of money in lawsuits. So Target was the first one, 2006. It was kind of the first one that established that you could sue somebody over non-accessible websites. Before that, the idea was that it had to be a brick and mortar store. Still along those lines, the reason that they lost was because they had a brick and mortar store who also did web stuff. At this point, it wasn't just websites, it was places that you could still go in and buy a physical product. American Council of the Blind versus Staples, kind of a similar idea. So this kind of established the idea that there were guidelines. We'll talk about what WCAG 1.0 and 2.0 mean, but the idea here is that the Target one was just, I don't know, you have to be compliant and make this work for blind people, I guess. That's cool. This one actually went through and said, okay, there's some guidelines, let's follow those. 2012 was kind of expanded to Netflix. Netflix, of course, doesn't have a physical store. So in addition to this being past screen readers, this one is about closed captioning. It also then introduced the idea that just because I don't have a physical store somewhere doesn't mean that I am safe from ADA lawsuits. This was kind of a big one that started getting a lot of the major companies interested, but still, 6 years ago, how many of you, show of hands, were thinking about accessibility 6 years ago? Kinda, because I wasn't. I didn't even know any of this existed 6 years ago. You may have noticed up until now, all of these were specific companies, National Council for the Blind, group of people for the deaf. This one was really a landmark case because it was the idea that individuals could sue as well. So in this case, she was trying to redeem her credit cards, wasn't able to because of a limitation. Bank of America said, hey, the rest of our website's accessible, but obviously if you get a credit card, her boards are part of that. She couldn't access them, they lost. Fast forward, kind of getting the idea now that confidential plaintiff, again, big lawsuits, big numbers, big names. In this case, they weren't trying to sue for money, they were just trying to sue for some level of compliance. And then the very, very most recent one, this was maybe 3 months ago, was probably the largest landmark case, in that another individual sued Burger King. So this one, I don't know what it's about. I don't know particularly why they're being sued. All that's been announced is that Burger King is being sued. Backing up, or I guess fast forwarding, other way. 2017, plaintiffs filed 814 federal lawsuits. This isn't states, this isn't district courts, this is just federal level. Anyone have a guess what 2016 was? What?
320.
That would have been an amazing number. It wasn't 3. It was 314. But still, over double. We get to the first half of 2018 alone, there's been 1,000 on the federal level. So now all of a sudden, websites, companies that have websites, that have apps are starting to care because they're realizing that this could be very, very expensive. They're getting sued, their competitors are getting sued, basically everybody's getting sued. There's also been a rise of class actions. The average cost is $10 million. So this isn't just a small amount of money anymore. This is potentially increasing amounts as these class actions grow. Retail and e-commerce were traditionally areas that weren't really affected. It was a lot of things around like banking or healthcare. If you think about healthcare, there's going to be a lot of people who have some sort of disability. Obviously, you're going to have a lot of people, whether it's a permanent impairment, temporary impairment, whatever, who you have to design for. Banks, I get asked this question a lot. How many people have noticed the braille on an ATM and wondered why? That was actually one of the very first ADA lawsuits. And the idea is behind, well, it doesn't necessarily be the driver. I could take a taxi to an ATM, they could pull forward. I could give the driver my information. You know, I could get out, walk up to the ATM, whatever it was. That was actually one of the first landmark accessibility suits in banks. But now all of a sudden we have all these other ones. So just in my day job, I've actually worked with a number of companies all around e-commerce in this area particularly. Obviously can't give names, but there are several e-commerce people who are located in the greater Milwaukee area who are already considering this because they're about to or are currently getting sued. So it's definitely something that is in the Milwaukee area. If we fast forward, just look at last month alone, there were 156, again, just federal lawsuits. Oh. So there's bars here that you can't see on this projector, not just floating numbers.
Accessibility.
But, anyone?
So those lawsuits, do they only kind of affect consumer-based websites, or if you have a website and you have employees using the
Yep,
website?
good question. So they traditionally have been business to consumer facing, but there's been some internal ones. If you have an accommodation, let's say your hiring practices are ADA compliant, whether it's practice the website, that could be whether it's an internal application that no customer is ever going to touch ever, still potentially a problem because if you've got people who are blind working for you and they can't use it, or they are deaf or whatever it is, you still have to provide those accommodations once you hit a company like a certain size. I don't know if there's any specific regulations around internal size yet. That's kind of a new growing area. But ADA in general applies when you have 15 people. But the majority of my talk, and the reason I went through that part so fast, is because I don't want to sit here and talk to you about lawsuits. It's why companies are going to care about them, but it's not why I care about them. If you're not in danger of a lawsuit, you should still strive to be accessibility compliant in some way. You might not get complete, you might not get perfect, but something. You should put some forth of an effort. Any idea of how many people with disabilities use the internet on a regular basis? Percentage?
30%. 5.
It's 92. That's actually higher than the average for the United States. If you think about somebody who's quadriplegic, actually a coworker of mine, his father-in-law's quadriplegic, owns a business. How he runs that business is basically from his bed with internet. Internet has become an assistive technology for a lot of people with disabilities. They might not be able to go to the stores easily. They might not be able to just run down the street to pick and save or Target or something. So how they actually are able to continue to enable their own lives is by using a lot of online services. 91% of people with disabilities use a mobile device such as a cell phone or a tablet. For a long time, this was Apple and just Apple, because Apple had built in some accessibility stuff to the iOS system pretty early on. Material design has caught up. Material design has some fantastic accessibility features. You see a lot of stuff around Microsoft. Microsoft Inclusive Design, they have a great toolkit. I actually reference that later. But all of these large companies are really catching up and trying to enable these experiences. If we think about who officially has a disability in the United States, 1 in 5 people have a... There's people here, and they all... This is the person who has a legal recognized permanent disability, or I guess the other ones do because they're invisible. But this person, who we can see, has a legal, official, recognized permanent disability. So what I mean by that, it's not going away. Missing limb, you're not regrowing that. If you are blind, completely deaf, there might be some technologies who can help, but we're not there yet. You're not becoming unblind in almost every single circumstance. And then, of course, Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive impairments are an increasingly large percentage of the United States. As our population ages, we're going to have more and more of that. We're not quite caught up, just more like Japan. Japan actually just announced, I think it was June, as of June of this year, 20% of their population is over the age of 70. 20%. So here's our 5 people, but this time you can see a little better. But if we expand past that, anyone can have a temporary impairment. So I don't want to just design for people who are deaf. I don't want to just design for people who are blind or have Alzheimer's. I mean, of course I want to design for them, but I want to design for other people too. So when I'm going through and thinking about coding, and by design, of course, I mean both the physical, but also, the code structure and everything else, I want to think about people who might have temporary impairments. Broken arm. Sure, that arm isn't gone, but they can't use it. If they have some sort of hearing loss, they just had LASIK eye surgery, probably not going to be able to use those senses, even if they're not permanently gone. I guess somewhat cruelly, I saw an app about 6 months ago that was for LASIK patients, and it was a guidance to help them get through the first 6 months post-LASIK. And it had really, really, really bad contrast. And you can't really see very well for the first 2 weeks after having LASIK. So they've luckily fixed that, but not a good idea. But I'm going to expand this even further. Not just permanent disabilities, temporary impairments. Really what we're talking about here is situational awareness. And the idea that accessibility affects everyone in different situations. So some examples. Holding a bag like a laptop, or holding an object like a bag or a laptop. I went through and I did a big redesign for Milwaukee Tool about 1.5 years ago to be accessibility compliant, to be used by one hand. Most contractors, if you end up losing your hand or you're in construction, you're not going to keep working in construction. Generally, you need both hands. But we still designed their app to be used by one hand because this was an app that was made for controlling drills. And if I've got my drill in one hand and I've got my app where I'm setting my torque in the other one and I'm trying to make finite repairs, it's very, very hard to be able to do that with two hands. So instead, we designed it so that they could use it and control it with just one hand. You also think about construction workers. The stereotypical construction worker uses their hands a lot, which means that they're going to be a little more muscular, might be a little rougher, which means that these small, cute, dainty button tap sizes that come default by iOS and Android, they were literally hitting multiple buttons at one time because their hands were muscular enough. Not a disability, not an impairment, but it's just a situational awareness. Same thing with all of these. Loud environment, sunny day, glare. If you're designing an app that might be used outside, you of course have to design for a higher contrast because of potential glare. That doesn't mean that your users are going to suffer from any impairments. It just means that in that particular situation, it might be a little bit harder for them to see. So this is my Microsoft example. 26,000 people a year lose an arm permanently. Is that enough for you to care in your app? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know what your particular user base is. But 13 million people every year break an arm. All of a sudden that number gets a lot bigger. Then we think about, and their example was 8 million. I don't particularly know where this number came from. These came from the CDC, but regardless, that starts to get a lot bigger when you start to think past permanent disabilities. You're still doing the same things. You still have the same inclusive design practices, but in this case, you're trying to expand your audience. And when your audience already potentially is 1 in 5 people with a legal disability, all of a sudden now, past that, you can reach the other 80%. So this is a thing that you might have seen earlier in my inspirational quotes before we got to the comic, but I really liked how Microsoft phrased it. And their idea is that they design to embrace the things that make us human. They're not trying to design for the idea that there's a perfect human. They're not trying to design for the ideal or say that, yes, everybody is going to fit into this bucket. Instead, their philosophy is that they're going to embrace that. They're going to embrace the differences and design to create a world that makes lives better through assistive and inclusive technology practices. Side note, kind of hilariously, 5 years ago they got sued for accessibility too. But now, they've seen the error of their ways. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is all well and great, but what does it even mean to be accessible? Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with W3C. First time I've gotten so many head nods with this talk, so that's exciting. But they basically went through, they set guidelines for inclusive design. Their intention was not ever to make this the law. Then the Department of Justice sat on their feet for a long time. Decade goes by, 15 years goes by, 18 years goes by, and then the Department of Justice decided that enough people were using these guidelines and we'll follow these too. So they kind of accidentally set the official law. So WCAG 2.0, so we'll talk about that in a second. They are the ones who created that. That is now the guidelines for ADA. It influences both websites and mobile apps. Mobile apps less so, but they have some revisions coming out that will be a higher impact. And then how you can remember it. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I wasn't entirely sure of the audience. I was tempted to say pour one out. But either way, you can remember it pretty easily. So there are some official definitions. Their official definition for perceive. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in a way they can perceive. But what does that actually mean? They can find all the information that they need. They go to the website, they can literally see it, they can literally perceive it. They might not understand it, they might not have any idea how to use it, but they can at least figure out that it is there. Yep. The idea of text, readable, images are readable. If you have error messages, it's not solely depicted through color. People can kind of figure it out. This is still kind of, at this point, very high level. Perceivable is not something that you really get into the nitty-gritty. You're not looking for high contrast. You're just making sure that most people can generally find it. Rule of thumb, is it readable? Can I kind of have a higher color contrast? Use readable fonts. So these are just, at this point, basic usability. If you're designing a modern-looking application and has some basic usability built in, you probably have already reached this. So here's a great example because of the projector. Contrast. This is a terrible. My purposeful thing here was that it was bad contrast, and I think that's illustrated really well here. We think about our situational awareness. In this case, I don't know if any of you are colorblind or not. Doesn't matter. Our situation has made it so that our contrast hasn't been high enough. It's not adequate. If you think about people who are less technology savvy, maybe they're a little bit older, people who are not as likely to replace technology, they're still on CRTs. These are all people who are going to have this problem regardless of any color contrast, color blindness issues or not. Another thing around perceivable, pretty straightforward. The idea here is that, hey, this one is more readable than that one because the font is bigger. So on mobile, it's not 8-point font. There's some guidelines, generally 14 pixels is the minimum, or 14 points, but that changes depending on what you're doing. But the idea is, pick it up, look at it on your phone. If I can read it, good enough. Here's an example from, it's a mock-up for Lyft that has actually since been included into Apple. The idea here is that they purposely used very little information. They made it high contrast. You're going to be out and about, maybe you're walking, you're looking for a lift, you might be outside, there might be glare. They're trying to design a very streamlined process so it can be used by as many people as possible. So the second of these guidelines, user interface components and navigation must be operable. This is, again, these four are the official definitions. What does this mean? They need to be able to get to and from all non-decorative elements on the screen. How many people test with keyboards on their websites? Raise your hands. Keep your hands up if you test with the keyboard input on your mobile site or mobile app. Got one. People who have Parkinson's might not use a traditional touch display. They could potentially use a keyboard on your mobile app. That's an input you need to account for. It's something that most people don't think of, but again, you need to be able to get to everywhere on the website, regardless of the means. So that could be a mouse, that could be keyboard, that could be some other assistive device. Additional plugins, this is one that I like harping on especially for the JS folks, because there's plenty of JS plugins, not so much lately in the past 2 years, but that ruin everything. I obviously don't have to tell anyone in here that Flash can go die in a fire, and I can't believe people are still using it. 0% of Flash is accessible, none of it, just back away. But still, even with some modern JavaScript apps, it can happen. It'll mess with things like alt tags or ARIA, it'll make it so screen readers get trapped. You just need to start testing those if you don't actually know the accessibility impact. Design for a variety of contexts. Again, we talked a little bit about those keyboard traps, making sure that you can actually use a screen reader. Screen readers can be a little bit challenging to learn, so that's a little bit of a learning curve, but still just starting to go through and design for those contexts so people can actually operate the website. So here is an example. Theoretically, there's a box here. When you tab, there's a box here and then here. So what's happening is they're highlighting each link as you're tabbing through. It's telling you where the keyboard focus is. Mobile displays, or mobile inputs here, very helpful for somebody with any sort of cognitive problems, just helpful in general. A lot of this, again, is basic usability. Twitter, there used to be a period of time where when you tried to tweet and you opened a new tweet, you would get stuck here. It would be a keyboard trap. You wouldn't actually be able to get out of this unless you decided to send a tweet. So I hope you really, really had to say something, because if you changed your mind, you were stuck here unless you had the ability to use a mouse. Obviously, that's no longer the case now. They've gone through and done a pretty big accessibility initiative, but it was just something as simple as nobody thought to just try and tweet with just a keyboard on their website. Next one, information in the operation of user interface must be understandable. This one's probably the most ironic of them because I think this is not a very understandable definition for understandable. But the idea here is that if somebody reads it, they know what it means. They can go through, they can find the text, they understand what your app does and how it works. So if you have any really cognitive issues, that's going to come into play a little bit more. And then messaging is consistent without using overwhelming jargon. Whilst loading up a website with jargon might make some marketers happy, doesn't necessarily make your users happy. Don't use overly complex language. There's a pretty big initiative right now called Plain Language. I think plainlanguage.gov is actually a really good example, which is one of the few times in my life I've said a government website is really good, so take that one to heart. Label everything. We have a tendency to not include the labels in boxes. Material design, thankfully, at least moves the label into the box when you click on it and can type, but it didn't always do that. For a while, once you clicked on something, unless you used all of that, you didn't necessarily have the label still there with you. And then provide forgiveness. If somebody's making errors, if somebody's making mistakes, guide them. So some examples. This is particularly the worst effort to be cute I've ever seen. So on the left we have roost, migrate, and fly. What these actually mean, buy, rent, and sell. I don't know who decided roost means buy, migrate means rent, and fly means sell. So I look at these and I think, how do you get roost out of buy? But it was an app called Nesting Place, and they thought they'd be clever, but it's jargon. Even if it's not a big, overly complex word, it's still some sort of jargon that the user then has to figure out. In this case, I have to figure out, does migrate mean that I'm renting or I'm buying? It means that I'm renting, whereas roosting is buying. If you go through and you think about it, you can have that sort of cognitive process, you can probably figure it out. But why make them figure it out? Why not just use words that everybody already understands? This is an example, something super simple, alt tags. At this point, everybody should be adding those already. If you haven't been, you need to start. And this text here is actually on the image, which means that a screen reader can't read it. So if you want to, in this case, advertise to somebody using a screen reader, they're not going to be able to see that nighttime cameras and lenses are up to 40% off unless you have some sort of appropriate alt tag that'll be read to the screen reader. Here's an example from Apple. They don't go through and, they do still go through and label everything appropriately. I can tell what all of these things are. It's not making me, remember what I'm doing. The 16 hours of stand hours, it tells me when things are. They just do a nice job of labeling. And then the last one was forgiveness. This was for a big project we did for Milwaukee Tool. Previously to their login, if you had an email address and a password and you didn't remember what it was, it just said login failed. Super helpful. There are some security risks, of course, and some it'll have more of an impact than others. Some applications you'll be able to get away with saying your username's incorrect, your password's incorrect. I understand the security need sometimes to obfuscate that, but when possible, provide more information to the user. I believe it was XKCD who made a good point that we've trained users to make passwords very easy for computers to guess, but very hard for humans. Same idea here. Here's one from Spotify. They have not fixed this. This one's probably my favorite error I've seen. I don't know what happened. But an error occurred. Not helpful with forgiveness. What do I do now? In this case, I can go back, okay? But what if I get the same error again? I don't know what's happening here because they're not providing me more information. Even something as simple as Spotify is offline. Spotify can't connect. Spotify doesn't know what's wrong, but maybe try again in a bit. Provides me some sort of action. Layout. Traditionally, SDKs have a lot of this in mind, which is helpful. There's been a lot of effort from Apple and Google to design accessibility in their SDKs. Again, sometimes you use them, sometimes you don't. The important thing to remember here, though, is consistency between mobile and website isn't necessarily a requirement. So what you're doing is you're designing with accessibility in mind for unique situations. We talked about before, situational awareness. And if that mobile device means that I have a different layout or a different set of patterns on mobile, that's fine. You don't have to make everything on your website accessible to everyone all the time. You just have to think about the context and providing the appropriate amount of information for the situation at hand. Just a picture of some layout. Nice card sorted. Last one. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. This is the part when people think about accessibility, they think about this, because they think usually screen readers. And that is accurate. Or voice assistants. Resizing, taps and touches. So here, another question. Last time you were working on a website, how many of you tested it to see if it would resize appropriately to 200%? Couple of hands. Websites actually used to really break when you resized because they were not responsive. So if you resize the text, it didn't matter. But now that we have responsive, sometimes what happens is that you'll get this weird combination between mobile and a website. I did an audit for an e-commerce company located a little bit south of here, and they had this weird sort of half mobile, half desktop, but you couldn't actually use either, but it would show both, kind of in this weird overlap. I don't even know how that happened, but they didn't test with resizing. Make sure screen readers can use your design. If you never get here, that's okay, because I know screen readers sometimes have a big learning curve, but you want to start getting there. And by starting to get there, you can do things around ARIA, alt tags, but ideally, in a perfect world, everybody would be able to test a screen reader. Performance and speed issues, preaching to the choir there. Obviously, you don't want something super slow. By responsive, I literally mean responsive, design, adaptive, again, preaching to the choir. Users should be able to easily break your website, app, or product. It's amazing to me how many different apps will break with a screen reader almost instantly because they have not really been tested. They're not robust enough to really work outside of the perfect context that has been designed. Android uses TalkBack. iOS uses VoiceOver for screen readers built in. Macs have one built in as well. There's a variety of them on Windows. The most popular one is JAWS. It's J-A-W-S, like the movie. But avoiding unnecessary sounds. This is something that thankfully, hopefully, will die soon. But if you think about like Netflix and you open it and all of a sudden there's something starting and you can't stop it and oh my god, why is there an advertisement playing for this show? You keep showing it to me, I really don't want to see this. Also, that's going to completely break a screen reader. Make sure that they can pause it, stop it, start it. Don't auto-start a video when I come to the website because I might not know where it's coming from, I might have a cognitive problem, or it might just completely break my screen reader. So again, how you remember that is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Any questions so far?
Would you consider like bandwidth would be not disability but part of accessibility? So if you were at like a limited bandwidth.
Yeah, so the question was if low bandwidth could potentially be part of accessibility. I'll answer that in 2 ways. From a legal standpoint, no. From a situational awareness, you could use some sort of graceful degradation. You could notify them that their bandwidth is causing some issues. So because of that, we have some limited functionality available. Really, the goal is to try and inform the users as much as possible. We have a lot of information that we can display and can give them, but we don't. Other questions so far? So there are really 3 types of accessibility that we're going to talk about. 3 levels of accessibility, and these are the mapping to the legal definition of levels. So WCAG, Web Consortium Accessibility Group, they're part of that W3C group, the WAI group. They're the ones who set these levels. The idea at A is at the lowest level. These should be things that are very easy to do that impact a high amount of your population. And I suspect most of you are doing most of these already because a lot of it is just basic coding practices, a lot of it is just basic testing, or just basic usability. The idea being that these are going to be very easy to do and have a very high impact. The medium one is a little bit harder to do, but still have a high impact. And then that last one is that focused improvements for specific users. And that's kind of where you get into like complex refinements, and most companies will not get to that level. The legal requirement is 2A. So the high impact but a lower portion of the population. So some examples for each. Level A. Text alternatives, captions for audio, avoiding jargon, don't rely solely on color, using a meaningful heading structure, labeling your form fields, and no major code errors. I'm going to guess most, if not all of you, already do all of these things because they're not that hard to retain, and again, they're just good coding practices. Level 2A gets a little more complicated. It starts to build color contrast. This is where you start getting into that. So level 1A doesn't even have a color contrast requirement. You could use very, very light gray. You could use EF on white for all they care. Can't do that here though. You have a minimum color contrast of 4.5 to 1, which is not that high. It's still pretty doable. It still might not show up on certain screens, but it's kind of that give and take with marketing. You know, marketing and branding are going to say that we absolutely have to have light blue on slightly lighter blue because that's the way it's going to look perfectly. So this is a good argument to counteract that and to say mathematically this does not work. This is just not going to happen. And it's not an opinion between two people. It is literally a ratio of 2 hex colors. It's a mathematical concept, and it's a way to arm against saying that, well, our light gray on lighter gray has to be this way. Taxing to 200%, suggest alternatives. Keyboard focus is clear. So when you're tabbing through, show what they're actually being able to tab onto. A lot of places do a nice job with the navigation, but the navigation is static. The navigation rarely changes page to page. Where people will get into trouble is on their dynamic pages, like product pages or search results. And inevitably, there will be something that doesn't have a proper update, something will break, some other team comes in, because it's never our team, it's always the other team. But something will happen. And then I can tab forward and back through the website. If you take one piece of advice from me, just one, it's to go find whatever you're working on and try and tab with it. If you're on a mobile device, that would require buying obviously a keyboard if you don't have one. But even if just on a website, tab through. It's surprising how terrible the website is for just keyboard usage. And then level 3A, obviously everything in 2A. Videos have to have a sign language equivalent. This, I don't know if I've actually seen a website that met that standard, which would be awesome if they did. They don't. So this would get into the complex refinements that impact a low population. So this could be somebody who has some sort of dyslexia, but also has some sort of deafness. There might be an overlap. It might be a specific situation. It's going to be very tailored to very specific subsets of your users. No images of text. If none of these other ones can be accomplished, that one can be accomplished. And I find that marketing, again, is the one that, maybe I'm just picking on them because I don't know if anybody here is in marketing, but they're easy to pick on. No timeouts. That one's the one that I go back and forth with all the time. It's very hard to design something that has no timeouts. There's certain, Azure requirements, there's certain security requirements. But if you have the ability to never time out users, think like Google Drive never times you out unless you accidentally log in somewhere else and have this whole other thing. If you can, whenever possible, remove timeouts. And then provide detailed help and instructions, especially if new workflows, complicated workflows. Don't make them remember how to do things. Is that a question?
Yeah. So wait, so sign language or closed captioning would not be an alternative in that?
So it would be in 2A. Closed captioning would be an alternative in 2A. But in 3A, we're assuming that not all of our population or our audience can read. 16% of people in the United States are functionally illiterate. So that 16% could have overlap with other disabilities as well, or other situational problems. Good question, though. So what level is right for you? Unless you're getting sued, this is generally what I figure out, it applies. Get everything you can reasonably get done. Obviously, if you can't get it done in your budget and your time frame, it's just not going to happen. But if you've got it, time for it, do it. You should be able to meet all level A criteria minimum. If you haven't done that already, you probably will be able to fairly easily. And then level 2A, as you learn more about accessibility, as you get this more involved, level parts of it at least can be accomplished pretty easily. There might be some that are a little bit harder for your company's skill level or just website or app in general, but over time those can be accomplished. And then there are some things in 3A that some companies can accomplish. If you can, great. If you can't, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just by getting to 2A, you're already going to be significantly better than a lot of your competition and a lot of other websites and apps in general. So let's do some exceptions. You or your direct competitors are facing a lawsuit. Obviously, if you have to spend the money, you might as well spend the money on fixing it because you're going to have to spend the money on fixing it anyway. So you might as well do it before you get sued. You're about to undertake a large redesign again. You're spending the money anyway. And the third one, if anybody works for this company, please let me know. You've got large stacks of cash that you're willing to burn on projects. I don't think that's ever... These first two are far more likely. So getting started. Critical path. By that I mean figure out what it is that most of your users are trying to do. You're not going to be able to tackle everything overnight. Even a simple e-commerce application for a company that thinks they only sell 7 products, which I just helped them with, they thought, hey, that's all we do is sell one thing. They did not look at their critical path. Turns out you had to pick a size for everything they sold on their website. You couldn't access the sizing with keyboard. They didn't match their critical path or an accessibility compliant. Over time, if you want to add all the FAQ, all the sign-in, all these other things that aren't as critical, great, but at least start there. Full audit, if you've got the money, if you've got the ability to go through and figure out where in your website and everything on your website, everything on your mobile app, great. Most places will not. Triage, level A, let's get those done. Level 3A, let's put those on the backlog with all the other things that we claim we're going to do, but we never actually, story point, we never actually get to. They'll make a great addition. Educate and train, this one's probably the important one. Or they're all important, but like of all of them, the most important. Let's say you go through and do the first 3, you're completely accessibility compliant. Some of the people leave the company, you've got some new code practices, whatever it is. You have to maintain your accessibility. You have to build into your company the idea of inclusive design and accounting for all users. Because if you don't include the idea that you want to account for all users, what's going to happen is you have new people, new management. Management's going to come in and say, why are you spending this money on this thing? We don't have a body, we're not spending this money. And then you're going to get back to where you started. And then building it into your cycle, dev cycle. So if that's with quality assurance, if that's making sure that every 4 sprints or whatever it is, you take a look at it. If you just have a commitment that, hey, every sprint we're going to tackle one accessibility thing, whatever it is. By having some sort of iterative fashion towards it, you can make progress pretty easily, pretty cheaply. And as long as you're showing actual progress towards accessibility, actual progress, not legally defined, you won't get sued. Because as part of these lawsuits, they can't sue places that are making actual progress. TBD what that means, which is why it's all in quotes. But again, you're making some progress, not getting sued. So are there any questions before I go on?
How do you test for accessibility?
How do you test for accessibility? So color contrast, you go through and measure. If you're testing for the ability to, keyboard inputs, you literally use a keyboard. If you want to test for screen readers, you're going to use a screen reader. A lot of this you can do yourself. There's a lot of things in your code structure, like your headings need to be marked appropriately. But if you really get to the point where you want to get meaningful accessibility feedback besides what you're able to replicate, then you would work with a company that would be like Independence First or an accessibility recruiting firm, or hey, my cousin's colorblind. And then you find somebody in that sort of situation. You just give it to them and see what they're able to do. While we can certainly replicate some parts of it until you become more fluent in something like a screen reader, it's hard to completely replicate that. But you can at least start, you can at least get to that compliance level, and then over time you can start to educate and sort of learn more and then have to rely on outside testing labs.
What's your opinion on tools like Lighthouse and Site Improve?
I think they're very good on paper, and if you structure your website appropriately, you can get to that. Unfortunately, they basically promise that they're going to be able to bolt on accessibility to the website. And if you make some sort of change to it that doesn't work with that, hey, that's not their problem. If you leave everything as is, it does offer some abilities, so especially depending on which one you use. Some of them will offer you know, hey, we're going to give your users the ability to resize, or we're going to give them the ability to change the foreground and background color, which will help them. Which it can, but you're still not building that education into your own department. So if you ever want to get off of that, if you ever want to stop paying them a subscription, and if you ever want to make sure that all of your code doesn't have to be passed and reviewed by that company, because their thing is that, hey, we are certifying this as compliant. You make one update, we're not saying this is certified compliant anymore, which means you have to keep using them, keep passing all of that over. You're basically adding a huge additional stakeholder to all of your reviews. But as far as them or nothing, definitely at least something.
So, one more question about testing. Is the expectation that an entire person should accomplish the same action but at the same time, or just accomplish a goal?
Just, so, not necessarily within the same time. So we had one slide that said no timeouts. So if I'm trying to fill something out and your website times out before I can do it, probably going to be an issue. But if you look at somebody with like a screen reader, screen readers can actually, people who are proficient with screen reading on a website designed for screen readers can accomplish tasks much faster than if you're trying to use a keyboard and a mouse. Because you don't have to read, it's reading to you. We actually process spoken language significantly faster than we process reading. And then you also eliminate a lot of times additional movements, you know, mouse movements, maybe keyboard movement, depending on what they do. And it gets to the point where you can actually turn up the speed on a screen reader ridiculously fast, and they can accomplish things in a way that are a lot faster than you actually just starting to read it out loud. But no, there's no actual, as of right now, no formal legal definition that you have to get it accomplished done in the same time, just that they can. Based on time, we'll probably start this one, but maybe we won't start this one. I'll send these out. So this is an example of a screen reader that is being read by somebody. It's literally, if you just Google screen reader demo, it's the first one. But I'll still send this to Tony to send everything out so you can view this on your own. But it's just an example of somebody using a screen reader and that ridiculous speed that a screen reader can move at. This is Wave. How many of you used Wave before? It's kind of like your cheater way to start using accessibility, but I mean that in a good way. So it's going to go through and do all of these things over here. These sometimes aren't necessarily always accurate. You have to go check them all. But what it does do is provide you a good framework. You just put in a URL, and it has to be a publicly facing URL. But you put in a publicly facing URL, and it will go through and crawl your website similarly to how a screen reader would. They're usually pretty accurate. Every now and then they get hung up by things that aren't actually an issue. The ones that do cause some issues are things like contrast errors. I found those never terribly reasonably accurate, but at least you have a starting point. And we can actually see down here, they have some empty links listed in here, which is an additional step for a screen reader. Because if you think about a list of links, we can kind of scan and find it very quickly, but a screen reader has to go through each one of those. So if you have a lot of empty links there, or a lot of empty headings, all of a sudden the screen reader has to go through each one of those still. That's another thing that it'll find. It'll go through and label any ARIA. It goes through and tries to label your tab ordering for you. And then it'll just label random features. I'm not entirely sure why they feel the need to list features, but the rest of these are generally pretty sound. That's a free tool. It's just Wave. It's produced by a company called WebAIM, whose aim is to make the web more accessible. This is Sim Daltonism, which this is a different color than the other side. It's another free app. The idea here is that Sim Daltonism replicates what it's like to be colorblind. So there are 8 different colorblindness tools that they actually will build in. In this particular one, this was a red-green colorblind. It has sort of a pinkish hue to it, and then it actually, Amazon doesn't particularly have any huge contrast issues, but you can actually go through and look at websites, how somebody would see it if they did have some sort of colorblindness. The one that was probably the most fun to play with is if you're on a website and they have red for forms that are filled in incorrectly and green for forms that are filled in well. Go look at that with Sim Daltonism. They will all look the exact same color. And then Red Stripe is a mobile app. Unfortunately, not named after the beer. but if you want, I do have it installed on my phone, but it will actually go through and stripe everything that's red. It was developed by somebody who did a lot of hiking, completely colorblind, and hiking maps frequently are red, green, blue. You could not tell the difference between them, especially because they then became faded, it was outside, had no recollection, and then it became increasingly an issue, so he just built a little app that literally goes through and calculates what's red and stripes it. There's a lot of interesting things happening in accessibility. That's a smaller one, more tangible one. But as other technologies progress in general, especially around AR, VR, it's been pretty exciting to see all the different changes in accessibility. So, any other questions?
Have you noticed, people that may not have a disability doing things just to, so for example, some people might want to just have the browser at 200% because it goes to the mobile version, or people might actually use screen readers just because it's faster for them to, process stuff or whatever, so they don't have it, they're just like using all those things.
Yeah, good question. My example there would be, if you think about somebody in your life who has their phone set at what feels like 800% and their text messages show all of like 4 words on them. They're not blind, but it helps them. There is a lot of that, and that gets back to that situational awareness. As some of these tools become more, progressed, they're more embedded into systems, there's going to likely be more exploration of them and more discovery of the tools. As far as the legal ability to meet that, no, it would just be the legal disabilities. However, situational awareness, we want to design for that when we can.
What's your opinion about JavaScript libraries? Do they have anything which can promote usability? Like Kindle, for instance. Do they have anything?
Yeah, so the Kindle that company, Amazon is actually undergoing a lawsuit around Kindle because they don't actually support appropriate resizing. But there's a lot of other non-website and mobile apps that potentially have this problem. The one that was probably the most ubiquitous, there's a paint company that got sued for their paint kiosks. Not web, not mobile, not really a lot of updates. Huge color contrast issues, people couldn't tell what paint color they were trying to buy.
Do you have any personal anecdotes, and in your professional life you do this, right? I mean, any anecdotes about how when you focused on accessibility, you managed to drastically increase sales, for normal people,
Yep.
right? Because accessibility is good
Yeah.
for everyone.
It is good for everybody. Probably the best example of that is the way Google crawls an engine or a website for SEO is the exact same way a screen reader reads it. So if you want all your content to actually be available to Google, if you want to get higher in search ranks, literally designing for a screen reader gets you SEO built, like complex SEO built in for free. Otherwise, apart from that, accessibility at its basis is designing an experience that works for more people. It is a critical part of usability, and by designing all of this, I can't imagine somebody going to a website and saying, well, I would have used this if it was a lower contrast. It's building in the ability to use things for everyone. I've certainly pulled out a phone, looked at an app, and not been able to use it outside, and then I've gone to a different app or done something else.
Does it overlap software versus hardware?
Software versus hardware. So there hasn't been as many physical hardware. Oh, zooming?
Hardware can white, maybe hardware. Also maybe some hardware could be black and white.
Yeah, so hardware goes back to the original ADA was for physical things. So if you think about like an elevator or a ramp or a wheelchair. So a lot of hardware actually has its basis before software. So I use the ATM as an example. You could argue that at least parts of that were hardware. As far as the level of complex lawsuits that software has had now, we're not there yet. I'd imagine we will be probably either later this year or starting into next year. Companies like manufacturers are starting to get sued a little bit more. It's kind of breaking out past just traditional websites and mobile apps. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So where do these lawsuits draw the line between a product that needs to be accessible versus something that the users may be entering into knowing that it might not be accessible, like a banking website versus World of Warcraft or something?
Bad example, I think World of Warcraft supports colorblindness.
Well, I mean,
I know, I'm just teasing you.
you get my point though, right?
Yeah, so that's why banking and healthcare were hit first. So if you accept federal funds, so think healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, you've already had that requirement. Banking already had that requirement because banks, again, very ubiquitous. E-commerce and retail were kind of the one that's the next wave. But again, you think about how many people use, Target, Amazon, Kmart got sued, which is kind of amusing because I didn't know people still used Kmart.com. But regardless, yeah, I can imagine that that is going to continue to change. See if I can find my specific slide around it. So yeah, these were the industries in July, just July. So where you're going to get into that is that other. It's not going to be as big, at least now. It might change in the future. In July, this was, I think, 3. Yeah, 3. It's getting there, but not quite.
I was hoping it would be okay if I added that increasingly our fellow developers also have accessibility concerns, and so it actually goes into our source code now as well. There's a great talk from GopherCon you can watch on YouTube where she goes over a series of tips for keeping your code accessible and readable.
Yeah, so keeping your code accessible too, like it's good code structure. There's a lot of code structure practices that people haven't necessarily always followed that if you include, but in general, if you look at open source, any major open source system, almost all of them, there's going to be at least a couple pull requests trying to make things more accessible, compliant. And it might be something as simple as contrast, but it is something. Developers, we do care about the world around them. They're trying to contribute to projects to build things. So I did keep this technology agnostic, but Angular has an accessibility platform, React has an accessibility platform. I'm not as familiar with Vue, but I'm sure they do as well.
I was just going to add, it also sounds like a great way to get into open source development. Here's a pull request.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a super simple thing that you can add, even if it's something little like contrast or reasoning. It's a great way to get involved, and it's a good impact. Not just hey, it's important to refactor code. It's important to have clean code and things. But if you're able to say that, yeah, look, my open source impacts basically every single user. This was my contribution. It's a great way to get started.
Oh, I'm sorry. You had mentioned a little while ago about it by designing for screen reader use.
Mm-hmm.
It has a direct impact on SEO.
Yep.
I think I also read that an extension of that would be also all the verbal searches like the Alexa and all of that. It's the more solid.
Yep. Same thing.
HTML, for example, right?
So if you have everything that way, also appropriately alt tagged, the more solid some of that structure is, the better for screen reader or voice assistants as well. All that gets into natural language processing. Screen readers do natural language processing the same way that any voice assistant would.
I understand that accessibility is kind of way of thinking, but also is there any settings, because when in Windows, where the colorblind person could set up for himself, and so I, as developer, could access for JavaScript?
I am going to admit to obviously using a lot of Mac products, so I don't know about Windows. But both Android and iOS do, and Mac does. I'm sure that there's somewhere in Windows, and that is an option as well. It's not necessarily always the most effective option, but it is a quick option. It's an easy fix. So in both Android and iOS, for example, if you are colorblind, you can go through and change the contrast in the actual operating system, and that will help. It works in most cases, not all, but in most cases, it will actually change the contrast enough to where it is readable and usable by them. I'm going to guess that Windows does because Microsoft has had a huge inclusive design push in the past 2 years.
In JavaScript, you could read the same contrast that use different styles.
Yeah, so that's another option too. Again, you think about just basic coding practices, creating a print style sheet, creating an accessibility style sheet. You can create an accessibility style sheet where you can have a toggle, even if it's just in the top right corner or something, where somebody can choose, low or high contrast mode. Might not be as pretty of an experience, but it's an option, and it's a way to provide that option without necessarily limiting the design elsewhere. You'll see that a lot with resizing of text as well as a separate style sheet option, and then you just present little buttons either on the right side or the top somewhere. All right, so I will send Tony these slides along with a lot of other links, or post them in the meetup preference. Okay, I'll just post them in the meetup. I do have some accessibility checklists that you can start using, as well as a couple different demos and these slides. I'll stick around, obviously, for a little bit if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, thank you all for coming. It's a topic I'm really passionate about, and I love talking about it.